Chapter 4. Ashkar leaned back away, the boy's fist coming dangerously close to connecting with his oft-broken nose, and he started to bring his left leg up for a stop kick, but the hook punch had been a feint. A moment later, as Ashkar raised his leg, his right leg was painfully impacted by a low-aiming hook kick, Titus following through with enough force to send Ashkar right down onto his tailbone with a grunt and pain-induced rumble laughter. Not bad, son, Ashkar remarked, gently getting himself back to his feet as the younger Minotaur grunted and snuffed his dissatisfaction. Don't call me that, Titus snarled. The pair stood in the small backyard of the Jacobsons' home, dense gloves and pads on their hands and feet to minimize any damage that they might do to one another as they sparred. The conversation between Ashkar, Titus, and John and Linda Jacobson the prior evening had been tense, to say the least. I'm only son to you thanks to the niceties of biology, Sutek, Titus said, deftly sidestepping an opening jab that his biological father threw to start an attempted combination. As the cross-punch came along, Titus lowered his head, letting the glove impact harmlessly into the hardened ridge of his skull between his horns. In a follow-through interrupt, he swept an uppercut out into the underside of Ashkar's jaw, knocking the older Minotaur back with a grunt. A few stumbling steps later, Ashkar got tangled up in his own feet, and he went down once more on his backside. He wished he could say that he was letting his son win this little back and forth, but the fact of the matter was, Titus appeared to be both a naturally gifted melee fighter, and John Jacobson hadn't been lying about putting a young Titus through a couple of years of training in kickboxing when he'd first gotten into high school. Given being on the football team, Ashkar had suspected that Jacobson was bluffing, trying to get Ashkar to set aside the suggestion that he and Titus spar, as was a custom of their people when a boy reached the precipice of manhood. Well, I called that one wrong, Ashkar thought, struggling back up to his feet, putting his hands up, palms out toward Titus, in a show of surrender. Titus immediately undid his gloves and stripped the pads off of his shins and feet, saying not a word to the older Minotaur. Do you have classes this afternoon? Ashkar asked, slightly short of breath. No. That's the only reason I agreed to engage in this nonsense today. I do have practice in a couple of hours, though. Titus looked off at the back of his parents' house, and for a moment, Ashkar wished he knew the boy better than he did, that he could get at least some notion of the run of his thoughts. You mind if I tag along and watch for a bit? I couldn't stop you if I did mind. Titus swiveled back toward Ashkar then, an eyebrow quirked at him. You spoke with my parents and I about the customs of our people, Sutek, at some decent length last night. But you didn't tell me much about yourself. Titus looked at the customized watch on his wrist, let out a sigh, and planted his hands on his hips. Before I head to the school for practice, why don't we go grab some lunch, and you can tell me about your time before coming to Earth. Maybe include some halfway decent explanation for why you abandoned me. Ashkar allowed himself to visibly flinch a little, which seemed to satisfy his son a touch. Okay, that's fair enough. Lead the way, Titus. As the pair came up alongside Titus's truck, Ashkar swung around toward the passenger side, and Titus patted the driver's door twice to catch his attention. What's up? I'm going to the campus after lunch, Sutek. Separate vehicles. His father shrugged, nodded, and headed out to the end of the driveway, his own vehicle parked at the curb between properties. As he drove out of the neighborhood toward the nearby Denny's, Titus felt his hands clamping down hard on the wheel, spotting a whiteness along his knuckles as he came to a slow, easy halt at the stoplight just before the chain diner. He took a deep breath, trying to consciously relax himself. It had been difficult to maintain his composure for the hour and some change that he had spent the prior evening sitting in the living room with his parents and this stranger who claimed to be his biological father. Not that I think his claim is fluff, Titus thought. The markings along his horn bases are too similar to my own to be a coincidence. That his father was shorter in stature to himself came as a mild surprise, though Ashkar was not small by any means, a broad enough fellow to send most Humes to the second stage of reconsideration before getting snippy or combative with him. During their little sparring match back at the house, something Ashkar insisted to Linda and John Jacobson was a timeless tradition among Titus's people. The college footballer had also determined that Ashkar was more than a competent, capable fighter. Not only was Ashkar swift on his feet, but the older Minotaur had clearly been holding back a little bit on Titus. In a real stakes fight, he probably could cause a lot of genuine damage, Titus thought, as he pulled into a parking spot along the front of the diner. The tension that had settled like a tick under his skin wouldn't go away, though, even when he had knocked Ashkar to the grass in the backyard. Moreover, that tension had a definitive edge of anger to it, one that cut across Titus's psyche in every word he spoke since Dad had said, "This is your father." He understood on a surface level why this abrupt meeting had so intensely upset him. Here sat the man who had been one half of his creation, and who had, according to what his adopted parents had been willing to tell him, abandoned him at Erie County Medical Center in downtown Buffalo, New York, as a mere 4 years of age, bordering on 5. Titus might have held some rage or contempt for his mother as well for a long time, but Ashkar had revealed to him, John, and Linda the previous evening that Titus's mother, Vela, had been killed in the crossfire of a street gang shootout in Boston when Titus was just 2 years of age. "She was only supposed to be going up the street to pick us up dinner," the older Minotaur had said, his eyes momentarily unfocused as he spoke, taking on that glaze that hovers onto a person's eyes when they are speaking of a memory further back than a year or so. "Eunice showed up at our apartment door, told me what had happened to her, that she had actually died in a car wreck trying to drive away from the crossfire. From then on, it was just you and me, kid. At least for a couple of years. Then things got complicated," he had said, his eyes turning shifty and unsettled. Stepping out of his truck and spotting Ashkar, as his biological father backed his sedan into a free spot, Titus found himself thinking on every police procedural show or film that he had ever watched, every Ed McBain novel that he had read in junior high and high school, and how suspects were portrayed responding to certain questions that they didn't want to give an honest answer to. That's how he looked when he got to that part, Titus thought. Everyday civilians don't call uniformed units unis. Only other cops and criminals call them that. Eyes narrowed on Ashkar, Titus stepped up onto the sidewalk fronting the diner until the other man joined him. When they stepped inside, Titus took a sharp breath, realizing that he'd possibly committed an unforced error bringing Ashkar here for lunch. Katie Thomas sat behind the little hostess's table, and when she looked up at them, she did a double-take blink at the pair of Minotaurs. Titus?" she said, quirking an eyebrow at him. "Hey there, Katie," Titus replied with a sigh. "Ashkar, this is my friend Katie. I went to school with her growing up," he said, indicating the tiny Hume girl. "Katie, this is Ashkar Sutek, a member of my family from Chaldea. He's an outworlder." Ashkar tried to put on a mild smile and inclined his head slightly to the young woman, who took up a couple of menus and guided them to an empty booth. As they sat down, Katie leaned in close to Titus's ear to whisper to him. "I can text Misha if you want," she rasped quickly. Pulling away, she nodded as Titus faintly shook his head in the negative. He would talk to Misha about this, of course. He practically felt the need to talk to her blazing in the back of his head. Not just yet, though. What'll you have for a drink to start, guys? Coke, both Minotaurs said in unison. Katie dipped away for their drinks, and Titus tried to stretch out a little, to quit compacting himself up like a wound spring. So, how old were you and my mother when you were pulled from Chaldea? Moreover, he said, a tint of genuine curiosity percolating in his mind, what exactly was that like? Immediately, Ashkar's nostrils flared, and he seemed to shrink into himself ever so slightly. It's been a long time since the Konar Tarn, Ashkar said after a minute, looking Titus in the eyes. That's from our people's native tongue. Do you know any of our verbiage? Some, yeah, Titus said. He tried thinking back on what little of the language he'd learned back in elementary and middle school. Ripping of the world, right? Tearing. But effectively, yeah. I remember the smell of it, the feeling in the air. It was like the moments just before lightning strikes, the crackling of raw ozone dancing along my skull. Magic, Titus, especially powerful magic, always carries an aura around it, Ashkar said with a mild shudder. It is foul stuff. The Konar Tarn, it was like a tornado of pure magic force, slamming down around us, your mother and I, and almost everyone in the village we were in at the time. The houses, the shops, all of them fell apart. Every board and brick and beam reduced to tiny shards of fluff. We were drawn up off of the ground against our will. There was a lightness, he continued, shaking his head slightly. And then this pressure, like a mountain giant had got me in its hands, and then a feeling of being thrown God knows where. And then darkness. Titus looked up to Katie and nodded his thanks as she set their drinks down then. You guys have a peek at the menu yet? She had her little order pad and pen in hand. I'll do my usual, Katie, Titus said, looking once more at the man calling himself Titus's father. Ashkar looked at his menu quickly and nodded. I'll just do a double cheeseburger, traditional, with fries, hon, and a side of cottage cheese, the older Minotaur said, handing her his menu. One check. It's my treat today. As she shuffled away, Ashkar ran his hands down his face and shuddered a little. I haven't thought about that day for a long time, Titus. I try to avoid thinking about magic of any sort. Our people don't take well to it. I don't know about that. I do fine. One of my best friends is an illusionist, as is her father. She's a half-elf, Chaldean dad, he said. Knife ears are always pretty talented with magic. Hey, Titus snarled, jabbing a finger across the table at the other Minotaur. Watch that. Gods be praised, son. Don't get offended on someone else's behalf. That's bitchy behavior. And our people don't go in for that kind of self-righteous nonsense, Ashkar snapped back. Titus considered this for a moment. He'd heard that term plenty growing up, and hell, he'd even used it himself. So why did it upset me just now, he wondered. It's different when it's a friend, he offered, feeling lame even as he said it. I know it shouldn't be different, that such a reaction is inconsistent. I wouldn't blink if you'd said retard or faggot, after all. Ashkar nodded. Exactly. You're pretty bright, Titus. Gods know you didn't get that from me, though. Vela was always the one with more than rocks to rattle around up in the old brain pan. So, what happened when you came to? When you woke up on Earth? Ashkar took a long draw of his drink and seemed to consider what to say. Most of us were just confused. We'd been pulled out of our village, and when we came to, we were all of us in the middle of some kind of building. Nobody knew where. Your mother came to a minute or so before I did. I'm thankful for that, because she was able to keep her wits about her and put her hands up when men with guns came into the room, shouting at us and aiming weapons. I've heard it said that the Hume language in Chaldea is close to English here, Titus offered. Yeah, close enough that she and another man from the village were able to beg patience and keep most of us from getting slaughtered. We'd been dropped, it turned out, into the middle of some army base in Kansas, right in their mess hall. And when I say dropped, son, I mean just that. The tear had ripped a section off of the roof in their building and deposited us like so much cordwood. Several of the children among us were injured in the fall. It's a miracle none of you were killed, Titus said. Short-lived miracle, Titus. When the soldiers started rounding us up and shuffling us outside, one of the guys from my crew got squirrely, put his fist into a soldier's head and got gunned down for his troubles within a couple of minutes. Ashkar snorted and shook his head. Telam was always a hothead, even for one of our people. Titus sat and considered this quietly for a moment, sipping his Coke. You said your crew, he prodded. Yes, technically, we were brigands, Ashkar said casually. At least, most regions in the nations of Tellero and Munkat dubbed us as such. When we all got working together, we were a mercenary troop, hired muscle. The Lord Mayor of the township of Mersenne hired us on when the entire constabulary of the town resigned, and that was our first big gig. It's also when I brought on most of our crew, over the 3 years that we served as stand-ins for the town's police force. What happened to the contract there? Katie brought their plates, and after taking a bite of his burger, Ashkar continued. The High Commander of Tellero finally sent a contingent of recognized constables to the township, and they brought a decree with them that thanked us for our service and offered to bring on board anyone interested in becoming a recognized constable, but at the official pay rate and under the oaths of service. Only a couple of our guys agreed to the terms. The rest of us, your mother and I included, had no interest in the oaths. The Hobbs in our crew definitely had no interest, given their nature. Titus quirked an eyebrow at his biological father. You know about Hobgoblin's, issue with promises and oaths, don't you? No, I don't. Is it a problem that has persisted here on Earth? Indeed, it has. It's part of their very nature, it seems. If a hobgoblin makes a promise, swears an oath of any sort, they can't break it, or it fucks them up. Like, physically fucks them up. It changes the color of their eyes, causes weird growths of these, bone spurs on their skin, shit like that, Ashkar said with a grimace, shaking his head. That's why their people don't get married unless they're deeply committed to each other. Titus considered what little he knew about the brawny greenskins. Is that why they usually get married after they have kids rather than before? Sort of proof of commitment before wedding vows? Ashkar, in the middle of chewing his food, snapped his fingers and pointed at Titus. Huh, interesting. More like fucking horrific, if you ask me. Now, mind you, these detriments only crop up if they consciously, purposely break a promise or oath. Accidents or external forces that are beyond their personal control don't cause them, though they do somehow become aware of the breach. Anyway, the whole of the village ended up being guests of the DOD for about 3 weeks before the government started trying to really figure out what to do with us. In the short term, Vela and myself were able to explain to our hosts that we were mates, and she managed to explain that some of the others were members of our mercenary outfit back in Chaldea. The 12 of us were separated from the others, and The Army started having us report to this on-base library they had, and they set to teaching us about, well, Earth. Titus finished his food and checked his watch, allowing Ashkar to tell his story some more then, with minimal interruption for questions for a little over an hour, listening to and watching the slightly smaller Minotaur intently. He learned rather a great deal from the man over that time, and as he drove toward the Buff State campus, Titus began trying to parse out how much of what he learned was likely to have been true, and how much of it was a load of horseshit. And he also wondered why none of it touched on the times since Titus's birth. "Jacobson, get your ass over to this sideline, on the double!" Coach Reynolds hollered from where he stood, as the team's primary sideline medics sprinted out onto the field to check on the dazed quarterback, who seemed more stunned than actually hurt. It would soon be discovered. Titus came to the sideline at a measured jog, rapidly unscrewing his helmet's horn caps and yanking the helmet off. As he made his way to the bench to sit down and down some water, the weather-faced defensive coach followed, leaning down to further berate him. "What the hell is your damage, Jacobson? You know that this is just a practice scrimmage, right? That Richards is our quarterback, right?" "Yeah, I know," Titus replied, refusing to look up into his coach's eyes. "And you threw poor Thompson damn near across the field to boot. Whatever the hell crawled up your ass today, son, evict it and let it back in when we play our first game this Saturday, all right? Pellington's players are their concern, not mine." Coach Reynolds headed back to his spot, leaving Titus to silently smolder on the bench, head hung down. When a weight settled in next to him, he didn't even have to look up to know who it was. "No concussion. He's just surprised you were shouting the whole way to the ground," Derek said. "Very R. Lee Ermey, let me see your war face vibes, my dude." Titus snorted a half-hearted laugh in reply. Derek nudged him into him, shoulder pad to shoulder pad, and Titus lifted his head. "You want to talk about it? Or do you want to break our backup QB too?" "If I wanted to break Steiner, I'd ask him to spell his position," Titus quipped. The pair of linebackers both chuckled lightly at this sally a moment, before Titus let out a long sigh. I'll tell you about it later, man." "Sure thing, bro. Maybe during Call of Duty if you hop on later." Titus grunted, and Derek put his helmet on, moving towards the sideline to play a few downs. Titus silently watched as the scrimmage carried on, getting himself back on the field soon enough and carrying on in a less dynamic, less violent beat. He'd needed those first few hostile snaps, though. Something in his blood called out for it. "Is it just a guy thing?" he mused between downs. "Or is it a Minotaur thing?"